Hi guys. Sorry, I'm seeing the light is weird here. Anyway, I'm gonna record a video lecture about food systems. I'm gonna do this in two parts. This is the first part, and then I'll do the second part afterward. So I'm gonna share my screen so you won't see me in this weird light anyway. So this is the content in chapter 7 in our textbook. Let's get started. Slideshow from the current slide. Okay, so we already actually talked about food systems a little bit in class one day, but I just thought it would be easier to kind of start over. So if some of this sounds familiar, you can kind of fast forward through that part. But thinking about food, we just want to remember what I think we already all know, which is that food is just such a basic fundamental resource that all humans need. And, you know, it depends on who you are and how big you are, exactly how much food you need to eat. But many estimates for adults say that we need something in the realm of around 2,000 calories per day, so that kcal is actually what we think of as a capital C calorie on our food labels that we read. And then, of course, we don't just need calories, but we also need quality of food that contains the different kinds of nutrition in terms of vitamins and minerals and proteins that we need to be able to survive. So, right, you can't survive on Twinkies alone. You can't survive on just rice alone, but you need to have access to quality fresh fruits and vegetables and other things that are going to be quality for you to be able to build the cells that you need, take care of your body, and survive and thrive, hopefully. And what we also know is that many people around the world do not have access to the level of food that we consider a really basic need. So as we discussed, we have over 7 billion people on our planet. So that's a lot. And about 820 million, so that's in the realm of about 12% of the people on the earth have this very kind of basic food insecurity. So this graph is showing the state of food security and nutrition in the world, and it's showing the people that are undernourished, that don't have this basic access to food. And then it is showing it both in terms of a percent scale, that's shown on the left axis, and then the kind of just numbers of people shown on the other axis. And so the numbers of people are shown in the orange, and then the percentages of people are shown in the blue. So we have a lower percentage of people on our planet that are experiencing undernourishment compared to a couple decades ago. However, that's still an enormously high number of people. And so this is one of our kind of major concerns about lifting people out of poverty and giving them the basic access that they need. And of course, this comes into our discussions about what is a human carrying capacity, what is our capacity to feed people, how many people can we feed, and can we feed in a sustainable way? So I think it's probably not a surprise to anybody that while we do certainly have food insecurity in our own communities and in North America, this is an area that is of greater concern in parts of the developing world. So places like in sub-Saharan Africa tend to have the highest levels of food insecurity. So showing in orange, food insecurity, and then severe food insecurity shown in red, and I'm not exactly sure how they define the differences between those things. But you can see 26% of people in the world have some food insecurity. So it's unclear if they're going to have enough food from day to day, from month to month. And then 11% of the people on the globe are experiencing very severe food insecurity. So it's very clear that they are not going to have enough food to feed themselves. So again, that's a really high number of people. And I think that's a big concern that we all have. So as we consider that there's this enormous number of people that don't have access to the basic resource of food, we often ask ourselves why that is. Why are we unable to connect people with the food that they need? And of course, it's a complicated question. Some people say, do we have the right number of resources? Do we have the amount of land? Do we have the amount of water? Do we have the amount of kind of arable soil to be able to support growing this much food? And what we find is probably, yes, that's true, considering that if we actually count up how much food we grow, we do have enough food to support everybody who's here. But what we struggle to do is connect people with the food that's grown. So of course, our food system is very complex. A lot of our food is thrown away. A lot of it's fed to animals. A lot of it rots, et cetera, et cetera. But the food waste problem is pretty massive. About 30% of the food that is grown every year worldwide is wasted or thrown away. And that's probably as high as like 40% in the United States. So if we consider how much food is harvested and not sold, how much food doesn't get harvested because of timing and different kinds of problems with connecting agricultural systems to workers, and then how much is wasted at the grocery store, how much you waste in your own home. Hopefully you're doing things like compost with your food waste. But in some ways, while this is a depressing statistic, it's also a hopeful statistic because it illustrates to us that we are good at growing a lot of food. And so we just need to think better about how we can connect people with those food resources. So that kind of brings us to some of the other problems, which is if we do have enough resources, why are we unable to connect people with the food? And so then, first of all, probably a lot of that has to do with just kind of geopolitics. Of course, a lot of times people are disconnected with food, one, because of poverty, but also because of political struggles, in particular things like wars that are happening in certain areas. So when we've had really crises of food shortages in places like Yemen today, or in South Sudan in recent years, or Somalia, a lot of times the food insecurity that's experienced by people is because there's a wartime, and so it's difficult to get food to the people that live in those communities. Of course, there's other problems, infrastructure problems that allow us to or prevent us from getting food to people or storing food in a safe and long-term way. But anyway, there's definitely a lot of room for us to improve the way that we can connect people with the food that's out there. So we have, as I just indicated, increased our growth of food enormously over the last 50 plus years, and also before that, to kind of meet this demand of people that are living on the planet, and there's more and more of us every year. So there was a lot of kind of doom and gloom, or there have been a lot of doom and gloom predictions from the past, going all the way back into the 1700s, post the Industrial Revolution, when our global population started rising, and then more recently in times of the 1960s, when we saw rapid global population rise, where people were very concerned that we would not have enough food to feed the people on the planet. And in some cases, they're right, because we don't properly feed the people on the planet. But as we said, it's not so much that we don't have the food to do that. And so we have ramped up our production quite a bit. So for instance, while our population growth has increased a little bit less than 2% per year, our food production has increased over that, a little more than 2% per year. And this has been able to occur for a couple different reasons. One, we've converted more land into agricultural production than we had in the past. But also we have experienced a phenomenon that's called the Green Revolution. And if you don't know much about this, you might think, oh, Green Revolution is something that would be kind of eco-friendly, right? Environmental. That's kind of what often we associate it with the word green. But in fact, the Green Revolution is a term kind of from a previous time that has to do with plant production. And it's not necessarily associated with environmental kind of quality of that production. And so what the Green Revolution was a huge investment, a lot of mostly in technology, that allowed us to ramp up the amount of food that was grown per acre. So for example, this graph on the right shows the increase in wheat yields in developing countries from the 1960s into the 2000s. And so it's showing how much grain yield there was in kilograms per hectare. So kilograms is about 2.2 pounds, and a hectare is about 2 acres. And so it's showing from the 1950s into the 2000s that our production, our yield, has gone from between 500 and 1,000, so maybe around 750 kilograms per hectare, up to about 2,500 kilograms per hectare. So it's more than doubled. It's more like, tripled during that time period. And that has been as a result of a lot of crop breeding. So we've done a lot of kind of before GMOs, before genetically modified foods, which we'll talk about later. We have bred crops to make seeds that we think will have genetic material that will allow them to grow big seeds and grow lots of seeds, right? People have done this for hundreds of years, thousands of years. We've also, unfortunately, in this process, bred many plants that we call high responders, because these are plants that may be able to grow lots of seeds or grow big seeds, right? Whether those seeds are wheat, or corn, or rice. But usually they do that with an input of lots of water or lots of fertilizer. So we call these high responders. These are plants that can respond, they can grow well and be very productive, but only if we give them lots of water and lots of fertilizer, which, as we'll talk about a little bit later, makes, in some cases, this food production not as sustainable as it could be. So we have bred plants, then we've used lots of fertilizers on those plants. We've used other kinds of pesticides and materials as well. We have invested in irrigation technology and harvesting technology, and all this has allowed us to basically get more food off the same area of land as we were doing 50 years earlier. And this in particular, I would like to say, applies to monoculture crop areas. So we'll talk about more sustainable and some regenerative farm concepts a little bit later on. And in most cases, we think probably these large-scale monocultures are probably not the best way to grow food. But if we are doing it in this way, the Green Revolution has allowed us to grow more food in a smaller area. Okay, so when we think about our food system, we know we are growing more food than we had before. We have a lot more people to feed than we had before. And we are also finding ourselves in a much more complex, globalized food economy than, of course, we were 50 or certainly 100 or 200 years ago. And so in class, I asked you guys to think about, where your food came from, maybe that you had just eaten in this particular day, and probably a lot of you have eaten at least some food or at least drinking some coffee or tea that is probably an international product. And so when we think about our food system, all these kind of interconnected parts of different organisms and different individuals and different businesses and different transportation networks and different kinds of stores where we actually buy our food, it's an incredibly complex kind of supply chain to get us connected with the basic organisms that we ingest as our food. And of course, a lot of times those organisms are combined in complex ways with other kinds of food additives as well that aren't really original organisms, and there's some health impacts, concerns around that too. But I think all of us in the last few weeks have really been forced to reckon with kind of the complexity of where our food is and thinking about how secure our food system is when we've gone to the grocery store and realized that, we shouldn't expect that we can always go to the grocery store every single day and have all the options that we're used to seeing, because many of these options come from places that might all of a sudden be disconnected from us, or maybe they're transported by companies that all of a sudden may not be working, or they're serviced by different agricultural workers that all of a sudden might be unavailable to us. And so I think it's really caused us to kind of reflect a little bit, or at least it's caused me to reflect a little bit about, where does my food come from? And do I feel that it's a very secure system? Okay, so with that food for thought, but Jing, I want to talk about kind of the sustainability of our current food production model. So not so much our food economy, how we buy and move and share food, and who works in the food economy, which is a whole complex and very interesting and very important discussion, but not one that we're going to have today. And in our discussion about the sustainability of our food production, I want to talk about a couple of these different issues that I'll kind of list here, and then we'll go through all of them in more detail. But when we think about food sustainability, the first thing I want to think about is just kind of land conversion for agriculture and habitat loss associated with that, ecosystem service loss that can be associated with that land conversion. Loss of diversity and the genetic diversity of the food organisms that we depend on, then soil management, and then some kind of resource issues. So how much water, carbon, other things are we using to make our food, and is that sustainable? Then some pollution issues, and then finally thinking about kind of our meat and seafood consumption and some of the strains on our system that are created by those industries. Okay, here's my land conversion slide. So first of all, I just want to say that we have converted a lot of our land in places like the United States and in places like China already into agricultural production from native forest land, from native prairie lands, hundreds of years ago. And of course, this has been done in all parts of the world, but currently a lot of the land conversion that's happening for agriculture is happening in tropical parts of the world. And these tropical rainforests were not completely, but in many areas, kind of relatively unimpacted by large-scale human deforestation and agricultural production until somewhat recently. And there has been a big transformation of these rainforest systems as people in these areas have increased their population and have increased their interest in kind of growing food in these previously forested areas, both for local consumption, but also a lot for commodity and different kinds of export crops. So there's a lot of things like soybeans that are grown in tropical rainforest areas and then shipped abroad to use for like animal food. There's also like some grazing that happens in these areas. And then there's also a lot of things like oil palm production in areas that have experienced tropical deforestation. So in particular, this is a study that's showing the kind of global oil palm kind of explosion that's going on. So these are a particular kind of palm tree that's grown to make oil that's in certain kinds of cooking oil, but in lots of things like Hershey's chocolate and other kinds of food products that you might eat. And so there's been a huge explosion in palm oil production in tropical areas, and this has led to a lot of tropical deforestation. But as I said, it's not only a palm oil problem, it's a kind of combination of many different kinds of crops. But this has led to lots of concerns about habitat loss, and then as we've talked about before, that can lead to biodiversity loss. And as we'll talk about more in the future, this can also lead to kind of changes in our global carbon balance. And so it can kind of remove carbon storage from soils and from organisms and put it in the atmosphere where it's creating problems for our climate. So this is one issue of concern about kind of our current dependence on tropical imports for some of our food supplies. Another major concern is about soil management and soil degradation. So we know that many past civilizations have undermined their ability to continue as they have devastated their soils. Massive erosion has led to food insecurity in these areas, and then has led to conflict and ultimately kind of led to fall of civilizations. This was probably true of things like the Greek and Roman empires in the past, and other probably areas as well. And of course, many people don't really spend a lot of time thinking about or appreciating soil. It's not the most glamorous or interesting. Well, actually, I think it's very interesting, but immediately, obviously interesting resource that's out there. But of course, it's so essential because we need it to grow our food, which is just like we're unable to live without. And many of the current kind of conventional agricultural practices, which for the record are actually quite new. This is not the way that we grew food 100 years ago, but many of these conventional practices are really degrading or destroying the soils. And so one of the ways that this happens is by erosion. So as we till up soil, we take plows, we run it over, and we remove either native vegetation or then different kinds of agricultural crops. And then we leave soil exposed to wind and rain for long periods of the year. We allow that soil to be very vulnerable to being carried off-site by wind and water. So this happened in times like the Dust Bowl, but we can see this happening around us all the time. One startling statistic is that in Iowa, which is a big agricultural state, famous for growing corn, they estimate that the state of Iowa loses through rivers carrying it away from the state of Iowa 1 to 2 pounds of soil for every 1 pound of corn that they grow. So that's a lot of soil loss, and unfortunately we don't make soil as fast as soil is lost in this way. New soil can form over long periods of time, but it takes effort and it takes time, takes organisms. So this is a resource that is quickly disappearing, and it's going to be hard to regenerate. And also, unfortunately, the soil that's at the very top, which is sometimes called the topsoil, or if you take soil science, you'll hear about it called the A-horizon soil. This is the soil that has the highest organic matter, and it has the most organisms in it. And all this organic matter and organisms is important for supporting plant growth. And so when we lose this surface soil, the soil below is not going to be the same quality, and it's not going to have the same capability to allow us to grow food. So what do we have to do when we lose our rich topsoil? Well, we have to put a lot of amendments. And these amendments are energy intensive. They can create pollution problems. And so we kind of become addicted to things like fertilizers and then other chemical additives as well when we degrade our original kind of higher quality soils. So anyway, these are some pictures of erosion. And then on the top right, there's a picture of soil fungi that are kind of growing intertwined with plant roots. And increasingly, as we study plants, we understand that all these plants have important associations with bacteria in the soil and with fungi in the soil that allow them to absorb the water and nutrients that they need. And so when we're losing all this topsoil with these organisms, and when we're further degrading these organisms by mechanically plowing the soil or changing the chemistry of the soil by adding additives, we're destroying these important kind of communities in the soil that can help our plants grow. Okay, another concern is about kind of this high responder idea that, yeah, we can grow food now, but it comes at the cost of adding lots of resources to our systems. And so, of course, one of the most fundamental resources that we require to grow food is water. So about 2/3 of all the freshwater usage that we have on the planet and in California is used for irrigation of different kinds of crops. Some of that comes from surface water, but a lot of it comes from groundwater, especially in drier parts of the world in places like California. And so we're going to talk about groundwater in a minute, but I just have an image here on the right that I want to talk about first. And this is thinking about how much water we really require. We're going to talk more about water later on, but I think this is an interesting perspective to have, which is when you think about how much water you need, you might first think about how much water you need to drink. And so you need to ingest either through directly drinking water or through eating foods and other things, somewhere in the range of like 2 to 4 liters of water a day. Then if you think about how much water you need to cook, to clean, to take a shower, to have basic sanitation, it's about 10 times that amount, somewhere in the range of 20 to 40 liters, or like quarts of water a day, right? A liter is about the same size of a quart, like a water bottle size, okay? And then if we think about how much water is required to grow the food that we eat every day, so not the water that's inside the food that we eat, but all the water that went into growing, producing, and manipulating and moving the food, it's hundreds of times that. So thousands of times what we need to drink, hundreds of times what we need for basic sanitation, but something in the range of 2,000 to 4,000 liters of water a day. So our food requires an enormous amount of water, and that is concerning because we really, really need access to good water, but also it's powerful because if we can make good choices about the kinds of food that we're growing and eating, we can really manipulate and influence the amount of water that's required to be able to do that. So as I mentioned before, in places like California, we get a lot of the water that we use to grow plants from groundwater. So this water is stored below ground in the soil, sometimes in fractured rock, and in areas below the ground where a bunch of water is kind of stored. We call those places aquifers. And unfortunately, we have a lot of people pumping wells from aquifers all at the same time. And this has led to a big groundwater depletion in places like California, but in lots of other places as well. And so this is leaving us a little bit vulnerable. We're kind of dependent on this water resource below ground that isn't, infinite, and we're depleting it over time. And at some point, if we're not properly recharging it, we're going to run out of this groundwater, and that point might be sooner than we'd like, maybe several decades away. And then we might find ourselves really unable to continue to grow food in the same way that we have before. So we'll talk about that more when we talk about water, but that is of course connected to our ability to provide ourselves food. Another problem that we have with groundwater use is that the water that's below the ground, that's in the soil, tends to have a lot of salts dissolved into it. So different kinds of things that are in the soil and in rock get into the water. And then if we pump up that groundwater and then use it to water the food or other plants that we're growing on the surface, then the water, a lot of it will evaporate away, but the things that were dissolved in the water, like the salts, get left behind. And we start to get this salty crust on the surface of our soils that is not conducive to plant growth. This salt makes it difficult for plants to access the water and nutrients that they need from the soil. And so this is a concern that is related to kind of the way that we use water to grow our food in many of these dry or semi-dry areas. So that is something that is an important consideration for our sustainable food systems. As I mentioned, we can think a lot about how our food choices might influence our water footprint related to growing food. So you can see here certain things like lettuce or tomatoes, cabbage, have a fairly low water footprint, a fairly low number of liters of water. Remember, liters is the same size as like a classic water bottle. And that's really different than some of these other kinds of grain based foods. And then in particular is much, much less than kind of the meat production. And we'll talk about that later on. But anyway, it shows you kind of the power we have to think about how we want to use our water to prepare food, to grow food. And if we want to have a more efficient water use or lower our kind of water use in our agricultural systems, we can focus on growing certain foods rather than others. So another major kind of input that is associated with food, or also kind of both an input and a product that's associated with food, is kind of the carbon footprint that's associated with food. So basically, this can be how much carbon is emitted into the atmosphere per the amount of food that's grown. And this carbon is emitted into the atmosphere associated with food production. One, because of fertilizer production that's required to grow the food, right? That is an energy intensive product to make. Certain kinds of food processing, carbon, soil loss that might be associated with agricultural practices, transportation of food, and then in the case of meat, all the resources, carbon-based resources that go into growing the food for the animal that we eat as food. And so you can see that food has a big carbon footprint, in this case shown in kilograms of carbon dioxide emitted per kilogram of food consumed. But then you can also see that there's a big difference in the kinds of foods that we might be eating and their carbon footprint. So things like lentils or tomatoes or milk or beans are going to have a much lower carbon footprint than things like cheese or pork or beef. So I love cheese. I don't plan on stopping eating it anytime soon, but it is kind of important to have that perspective of the kind of resource that is required and the impact of the different kinds of foods as we want to consider balancing our diets. Okay, so then the next topic that I want to address is about kind of the pollution that's associated with our food production. And we're going to talk about air and water quality issues later on in the class, but I just want to kind of address them briefly as we think about our food systems. And so, unfortunately, our conventional food systems lead to lots of different kinds of pollution problems in our environment. In particularly in places in our environment that are very close to the places where we produce our food. And this can come in a variety of ways, primarily through soil erosion as soil is being washed off the agricultural landscapes. The soil itself can muddy up water, create kind of water quality issues. But also a lot of times that soil is carrying different additives that we've added to the soil with it into the water, or as that soil is being blown away in the air, it's carrying certain kinds of soil additives with it. So those might be in the form of fertilizers, those might be in the form of herbicides or pesticides or fungicides. And as they end up off-site in our waterways or in our air, in our nearby ecosystems, we can see real water quality issues where we have increases in chemicals in our water, in big algae blooms in our water, toxicity in our water. We can have negative impacts on biodiversity and nearby ecosystems. And then, of course, we can have lots of human health issues associated with these issues as well. So again, we'll talk about these issues a little bit more when we talk about air quality and water quality later on in the class. But I also kind of want to think about some of the impacts of these, the use of these different kinds of chemical additives to our agricultural systems. One, they can create different kinds of human and ecosystem health problems, but also, unfortunately, what we're seeing is that natural selection is causing these particular chemical additives to become less and less effective over time. So essentially, when we add a certain kind of chemical additive or chemical product to our soil over time, continually with the hope of killing off a particular type of competing weed plant or certain kind of insect, what happens is the small subset of that plant, that weed plant, or the small subset of that insect group that just genetically is a little bit different than the other individuals in that species, and has a difference that allows it to be able to survive the spraying of that, in this case, herbicide, right, which is a chemical that's set out to kill plants. That herbicide will kill most of the population, but a few individuals who just have some genetic diversity that allows them to survive will survive. And then they will breed and they will have babies that will probably have similar traits to them. And they will also likely be able to survive the spraying of that chemical. And then they will have more babies that will also probably be able to survive the spraying of that chemical. And so we actually start to encourage the growth of a group of, in this case, weeds that is resistant to these particular chemicals that we're using to try to get rid of weeds. And so we kind of undermine our own interest here. So this happens basically with all the different kinds of pesticide, or in this case, herbicides that we start to use. As we start to use them, we start to have more and more, in this case, plants that develop a resistance to the herbicide. So we can see as these different herbicides were kind of introduced onto the market, then all of a sudden we started to have a rising number of resistant species. So glyphosate is one of the more recent kind of common plant herbicide introductions. You probably know this as Roundup. It's a Monsanto product, and it's often associated with different GMOs, which we'll talk more about later. But as this was introduced onto the market, then we're seeing the same pattern that we've seen with other herbicides, which is that now we have a larger and larger group of the plants that we were trying to get rid of through using the herbicide. And so basically at some point, this product really becomes obsolete. And this doesn't only happen with herbicides that are trying to get rid of weeds or other plants, but this can also happen with pesticides that are designed to kill insects. And so this is kind of another way to imagine that natural selection process. So on the left, at the top, we have these yellow and blue bugs. And so the yellow bugs are non-resistant to the pesticide. So when the pesticide is sprayed, they will be killed. But among the genetic diversity in that population, there may be some insects that are resistant to that pesticide, shown in blue. So we spray the pesticide, the non-resistant bugs are killed, but the resistant ones are left behind. Then they breed, and guess what? Now we have lots of bugs, all of which are resistant to that pesticide. So one way that we've tried to kind of minimize this growth of what are called super bugs, or in the case of weeds, super weeds, is to make sure that we're adding plenty of areas around our agricultural zones that are buffers where we're not spraying pesticides and herbicides. One, this could be important if those areas are like near schools or communities, so we try to limit contact with those, between those chemicals and people, but also because then in that community and that area where the spraying is not happening, we might have plants, or in this case, bugs, that are not resistant, that are able to survive, and then they can continue to breed in with the other population of bugs and kind of continue to maintain a population that has some of a good portion of the number of organisms that are not resistant. And so we don't build up these super bugs over time. So hopefully you can kind of view that left and the right and see how this plays out differently. And then these areas could be called like refugia or refuges for insects or weeds. Sometimes they're called buffers. But these are areas where hopefully we're kind of allowing the natural course of natural selection to take place and not forcing the hand of natural selection in a way that's undermining our interests. So, of course, another problem with the introduction of many of these chemical pollutants is that they might be killing not only the things we're trying to get rid of, but many important components of our agricultural ecosystems as well. So, you know, there's different statistics that I've heard over time, but said some things like for every one problematic insect that you have on your farm, you have over 1,000 beneficial insects. And yes, that one problematic insect might be creating really big problems for you that might need to be addressed, but hopefully you can find a way to address it in a way that's not detrimental to all those other beneficial insects. And so you've probably seen these kinds of statistics in the past, but we know that there have been big die-offs of many different kinds of insects in our communities, like honeybees, like other pollinators, like butterflies. And this is a concern to us, one, because we think these are interesting and valuable, important components of our ecosystems, but also they provide this important pollinator ecosystem service to us. And if all of a sudden these insects are gone, we're going to be having to work hard and spend a lot of money to replace that job in the ecosystem. And we may not really be prepared to be able to do that. So the pollution associated with these pesticides could be, again, undermining kind of our long-term ability to support ourselves and grow the food that we need. So when we think about pollution, we also, of course, want to think about humans. And humans are, of course, impacted by pesticide use as well, herbicide use as well, fungicide use as well. Usually pesticides are the biggest concern because pesticides are designed to kill animals, right? So they have chemicals in them that are most detrimental to animal function. And guess what? We are animals too. So those same chemicals that are killing animals on our farms might also be killing us if we have high exposure over the long term. And so, of course, certain kinds of crops are grown with more pesticides or more damaging, more concerning pesticides than others. And so there's a lot of information about that out there about which kinds of crops have higher pesticide residue than others. And so some things like apples, grapes, and strawberries. Sometimes you'll hear things about like the dirty dozen, the most kind of polluted or commonly polluted types of crops. And so if you want to put your money where your mouth is, when you go to the grocery store, you can think about avoiding these particular types of crops that might have really high pesticide residue for your own health, or also just thinking about your impact on the kind of environmental decisions that are being made. Or if you only have a limited amount of money and only have the ability to buy a couple organic products, maybe things like grapes or strawberries are a good way to go. And then maybe don't spend your money on organic asparagus or corn, which might have kind of a lower pesticide residue on it. And then, of course, the people that work in our agricultural systems are most vulnerable to experiencing this pollution. So some different kinds of studies have been done about exposure that people, different agricultural workers have. So for example, farming communities have higher rates of leukemia, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, multiple myeloma, soft tissue sarcoma, cancers, etc. So that's not a great health outcome for people who are on the front lines of supplying us with our basic food resources. Also, we know that lots of water pollution is associated with our food production. So this other interesting study came out that said 20% of small public water systems in the Central Valley of California, in this particular case in Tulare County, were unable to meet safe nitrate levels in their drinking water. So of these people that live in their communities, it's not safe for them to drink the water that comes out of their tap. And so many of these people are forced to spend money buying bottled water, which has whole other kinds of environmental impacts that we'll talk about later, but also is something that's probably very expensive, not really affordable to many of these people who are living in poverty in the first place. So this is kind of an environmental justice issue, as well as just kind of a basic health and certainly an environmental issue as well. So when we think about how we want to be growing our food, what kind of food we want to buy, we can try to think back and try to make our food choices in a way that we're hopefully limiting all kinds of people that are living in association with our food from these kinds of pollutants. Okay, a couple more things to mention and more good news about our food system. The last two things I want to mention about meat and seafood. And so meat is something that is on the rise. We're consuming more and more meat as a global and a US community over time. So for instance, your textbook kind of shows this kind of 50-year change from the 1960s to the 2010s, showing in developing countries that meat production went up 2.5%, from 10 kilograms of meat per year per person to 26 kilograms of meat per year per person. So remember, a kilogram is about 2 pounds. And then in the United States, during that same period, meat production went up from 90 kilograms, which is a little over 180 pounds of meat per person per year, up to 136. So that's more like 280 pounds of meat per person per year. So that's a lot of meat. And unfortunately, the reality is that growing meat requires lots of resources, and eating meat at this scale is not sustainable. So I don't want to imply that eating meat can never be sustainable. There's certainly ways that we can produce meat where we have animals grazing on land that's not really suitable, that doesn't have enough water for growing other kinds of conventional crops, or we can produce meat in kind of complex agricultural systems with rotation between animals and plants. But the kind of scale of meat that we are seeing on the world today is really not able to be met by meat that is grown in a sustainable way or produced in a sustainable way. So this huge boom in meat production is driven by a similar huge boom in soy and corn production, because almost all the meat that we eat is not from animals that are grazing out in green pastures or eating hay, but is by animals that are grown in or raised in certain kinds of feedlots that are fed soy and corn. And there is a lot of resources that goes into doing that, both in terms of water. So the graph here on the right shows the amount of water in terms of cubic meters of water that are required to produce 1 kilogram of different product. So corn or citrus plants require about somewhere in the range of 1 cubic meter of water to produce 1 kilogram of corn or citrus. Chicken requires about 6 cubic meters of water, so about 6 times as much water to make chicken as opposed to corn or other vegetables. And then beef requires twice as much as that, so more like 15 cubic meters of water. So the choices, as we've already said, about the foods that we're eating impact the amount of water that's required to make that food. But then if we also want to think about it just kind of on a purely food standpoint, how much food are we using to make our food? Well, if we grow plants and eat those plants directly, then we are getting the same amount of food that we're growing. So in the case of bread, if we grow 1 kilogram of bread, we can eat 1 kilogram of bread. If we grow 1 kilogram of like wheat, say, that we could make into bread, but instead feed it to fish, we're going to be able to eat a little bit less. We're going to have to spend close to 2 kilograms of grain to produce that 1 kilogram of fish. Chicken, a little higher. We're going to need a little bit of extra grain to grow that same kilogram of chicken. Then we're going to need more like 6 kilograms of grain to grow that same kilogram of pork, and more like 8 kilograms of grain to grow that same kilogram of beef. So instead of just eating that grain or feeding that grain to somebody in the world, if we're feeding it to an animal in a feedlot instead, we are reducing the kind of ability of that basic food resource to actually feed people, because we're kind of wasting it to feed an animal, and then we're getting much less bang for our buck, essentially. And this has to do with kind of the basic ecosystem trophic levels that we talked about earlier, right? We said there's this thing called the 10% rule, where every time we go up one level in the food chain or in the trophic system, we're losing a lot of energy and resources along the way. And so this is why trying to produce meat, especially in a system where that meat is not eating kind of native rangeland, prairie land type grasses, but is eating food that we are growing and using resources to grow, then this is really not an efficient way to produce food for the world. In addition, of course, a lot of these animal products are grown in what you might hear of as feedlots or confined animal feeding operations, where we have lots and lots of animals that are packed into kind of small spaces where we can try to efficiently feed them and house them. Of course, this is not a natural way that organisms would kind of survive in the wild. Even organisms that do like to kind of collect together in herds, they didn't ever naturally collect together in herds of this size, of this scale, with so little spacing and so little ability to move around. And so when we do this, we create a lot of kind of artificial environmental problems that we didn't have in the past. First of all, associated with animal waste. All the poop and the pee from these animals is a product that we need to deal with, and we might store it in different kinds of ponds, and then it might leach into groundwater and create groundwater contamination problems. We have a lot of problems with this in the Central Valley. Of course, when we have so many organisms in a confined space like this, then they have an ability to get each other sick and pass disease, right? This is not social distancing, okay? So they're passing their disease as well to each other. And so this might require them to use lots of extra antibiotics. And so about 50% of all the antibiotics that we use in the United States are not used to protect people from bacterial infections, but instead are just regularly used on our animals. And we know that bacteria can develop resistance to antibiotics, just like insects can develop resistance to pesticides, just like weeds can develop resistance to herbicides. And we have seen that a lot of bacteria are developing resistance to different antibiotics. And so then when we do have bad bacterial infections in humans, a lot of the antibiotics that we used to use are no longer really effective. And so there's a lot of concern in our global health community about the use of antibiotics for animals being kind of not a wise use of the antibiotics we have. But unfortunately, this very intensive, packed together way that we're growing animals is kind of necessitating the use of these antibiotics. So many people think that we really need to rethink the way that we're raising animals. Also, many animals are exposed to hormones. So this is particularly true with cows, not so much with pigs, or not true with pig production. But then there's concern about how injecting like bovine growth hormone into cows that makes them grow bigger and faster might end up affecting human growth and lead to kind of human health problems as well. So I don't think many of us, whether we're vegetarians or not, could really take a good look at the current animal production method around us and feel good about the way that it's going, just basically from an ethical standpoint and certainly from an environmental standpoint. So I will say I'm not a vegetarian. I do eat meat, but I try to eat meat in a limited way, and I try to eat meat from sources that I feel good about, locally raised animals, and I understand that that is a more expensive source of meat, so I try to not eat a lot of it. But this is definitely a very major kind of global environmental concern. Then the last thing I'll mention in this particular lecture is about fisheries. So of course, a lot of protein source that we eat worldwide doesn't come from terrestrial animals like cattle, pigs, chicken, but comes from fish in our oceans. And I think most of us are probably also not surprised to hear that we have been fishing for many years and many decades in a pretty unsustainable way, where we are taking fish in certain populations out of the ocean faster than they're able to reproduce and replace themselves. We're also fishing for certain organisms in ways that has lots of bycatch. So we're catching many organisms and accidentally or incidentally killing many organisms that we're not intending to kill. So there's a lot of waste in a lot of the fishing practices. And so there's a lot of different sources that you can use out there. But things like the Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch program publishes information that's updated every year. This is not updated, but you can go on their website and look at this. And it kind of recommends certain kinds of fish that are caught in a more sustainable way, and then recommends other kinds of fish that are really not caught in a sustainable way. And so if you are going to eat fish at some point, you can try to make a decision about a certain type of fish that you can feel good about. And hopefully there's lower kind of environmental impacts from the way that this fish is caught, whether it's grown in the ocean or if it's grown in some sort of aquaculture system where we're kind of growing shrimp or other kinds of fish actually on the land or on the shore in kind of a more of a farmed system. And certainly aquaculture can be done in sustainable ways, but unfortunately a lot of it is not done in sustainable ways, particularly in developing countries where lots of mangrove forests are cut down, and the aquaculture, especially for things like shrimp, is done in a way that's very unsustainable. So anyway, we just want to, again, kind of put our money where our mouth is, be educated about the impacts of our food choices, and try to think about that when we are a member of our food system. Okay, so I talked longer than I was hoping to, but that is part one. So I'll stop here and give you a break